He ordered calm and got fire, wrapped in a dress and a locked trunk. Remington sent away for a meek bride to quiet the years of solitude on his Wyoming ranch, and the agency sent him a woman who set terms before she set down her bag. Her first request wasn't a home or his name, but a garden, a lock, and the right to be left alone at first light, spoken the way a person speaks when she expects to be refused and has already decided what she will do about it. What she kept in that trunk, and why a woman like her would cross an ocean to marry a stranger, neither of them said out loud. Before this story begins, stay until the very end to see how it unfolds, and if it moves, you hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. 3 years alone will do things to a man that hunger and cold never could. Remington had built the broken spur with his own hands, raised the barn, fenced the lower pasture, and dug the well down to water that tasted like iron and snow. The work kept him alive through the first winter and the second. By the third, the silence had grown loud enough to hear over the wind, and the sound of his own voice had started to surprise him when he used it on the horses. The nearest woman was a day's ride into Coyote Wash, and she was married to the storekeeper, and that was the end of that thought every time it started. He hadn't always been alone out there. A partner named Boyd had helped him raise the first walls, a big, quiet man who could read weather in the color of the clouds. Boyd took a fever the second winter and died in the bed. Remington now slept in, alone. After that, the ranch became a place he worked instead of a place he lived, and the second chair at the table became a thing he walked past instead of a thing he sat in, because sitting in it would mean admitting he wanted someone across from him. A man can hold out a long time on pride and habit before he notices the difference between surviving and staying. The letter came the way these things always did, folded inside a matrimonial circular the stage carried out from town once a month. He had answered an advertisement the week before, sending money and a few lines about himself that he hated writing because they made his life sound smaller on paper than it felt in his chest. The agency wrote back with a photograph. A small woman with her eyes turned down and her hair pulled flat against her skull, and a name he couldn't pronounce and didn't try to. He told himself he wanted quiet, a woman who wouldn't look too hard at the gaps in his life, and the photograph promised exactly that kind of stillness, a face that asked nothing and offered nothing, a face built for a house where the silence had gotten out of hand. He pinned the railroad schedule to the wall beside the stove and counted the days off in pencil. He mended the second chair, fitting the cracked leg back together with glue and a clamp, and set it at the table across from his own and tried not to think about why. He bought new sheets in town and carried them home, and the buckboard folded under a grain sack so Walt wouldn't see them and grin, and he cleaned the house top to bottom for the first time since Boyd died, finding dust in corners he had forgotten had corners. By the week the train was due, he had shaved twice and hated himself for it. A man who shaves twice for a stranger has already lost the argument about whether he cares. He rode to the depot at dawn on the day the schedule promised, bathed and pressed and furious at the hope sitting in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow, and he tied the team and stood on the platform and waited for the iron to come in. The train came in, hissing and groaning, a long iron thing that looked as tired of the territory as everyone in it. Coyote Wash had built its depot out of warped lumber and packed dirt, and the kind of optimism that doesn't survive a second winter, and the platform was barely wide enough for 2 men to pass without one stepping into the mud. Steam rolled across the boards and thinned in the wind. The few people waiting stepped back, out of habit, the way you step back from anything in the West that might bite. Remington stood where the passengers would come down and watched the doors, and the hope in his chest turned into something colder as the car emptied. She stepped down last, small-framed and thin in a way that spoke of the road rather than frailty, with jet black hair pulled back tight and high cheekbones that caught the gray light. Her eyes were so dark they looked black in the shadow of the doorframe, and they didn't drop the way they had in the photograph. That was the first thing that went wrong between the picture he had paid for and the woman it became. She wore a dust-coated trail coat over a plain traveling dress, and she carried one trunk, lacquered black, no bigger than a saddlebag, but heavy enough that she set it down careful before she looked at him, which made the way she held herself all the more strange, because nothing about her posture said she needed help with any of it. He said her name the way the letter had spelled it. She corrected his pronunciation once flat and without apology, and let the silence finish the lesson he had expected fear, or at least the careful shyness of a woman alone at the end of the earth with a man she had never seen. What he got was a calm he hadn't paid for and couldn't name. She wasn't rude, and she wasn't warm, and she didn't perform the relief he had braced himself to receive. She was waiting the way a person waits who has already survived worse than a strange man on a dirty platform, and the waiting had a weight to it that made him feel like the one who had been sent for. He reached for the trunk. Her hand stayed on the handle, a beat longer than his, not gripping, just not letting go, until she decided to, and when she released it, she did so with the kind of care a person gives a loaded thing. He lifted it and felt the weight sit wrong for clothes. Something long and solid shifted inside the lacquer as the trunk tilted, and the question rose in him, and he swallowed it back down. He didn't ask, because the asking would have shown how little he understood, and he wasn't ready to show that to a woman he had known for 2 minutes. She walked beside him to the buttboard without looking back at the train. The train pulled out behind them as if it wanted no part of what came next, and the depot emptied and left the two of them alone with the road and the trunk between them. They rode out in the buttboard with the trunk between them, and neither of them spoke for the first hour because there was nothing either of them wanted to say that the other would answer honestly. The buttboard was the working kind, built for hauling feed and fence posts and anything else that needed moving, not the kind of light carriage that pretty people rode in back east. It rattled over the rutted road until the land opened up and the broken spur came into view at the bottom of a long draw. She looked at it the way a farmer reads ground, testing the slope and the water and the way the wind would run, not the way a bride reads a home. He noticed that and didn't know what to do with it. The house was low and solid, built close against the wind, with the barn set behind it to break the worst of the winter. Kerosene lamps in the windows threw an amber, flickering light across the yard as the dusk came down. She walked through the rooms once, touching nothing, her eyes measuring the stove and the water bucket and the single window that faced east, and she came back to the table, where the 2 chairs waited, the mended one and the one he always used. He set water on the stove and bread and salt meat on the board, and they sat across from each other and ate without ceremony, 2 strangers sharing a roof and holding back more than they showed. She set her cup down and told him her terms: a plot of ground for a garden of her own, a lock for her trunk, and to be left alone at first light every morning. She said it the way a person states conditions and not the way a person asks favors, and she watched him the whole time to see which way he would move, her hands flat on the table and her back straight in the chair. He had expected a woman who would be grateful for a roof and a name. Gratitude was the one thing her face didn't offer him, and the absence of it stung more than he wanted to admit. He agreed because the money was already spent and the train was already gone, and because something in the way she sat told him that refusing would cost more than agreeing, and she wouldn't ask twice. He found a padlock in the tack shed, a heavy brass thing he had meant for the feed room, and handed it to her across the table without a word. She fit it to the trunk that night without asking for help, her hands quick and sure on the clasp. The click of it closing was the only sound the house made, for a long time after, a small, hard sound that put a border around whatever she carried inside. The marriage was functional and awkward, and not romantic. Two people bound by a letter and a receipt, and they lay on opposite sides of a bed that felt wider than the whole territory, each one awake and listening to the other breathe. The days settled into a weary routine, the kind of quiet that holds because neither side has decided to break it yet. Mary broke ground on her garden the morning after she arrived, before he was out of the barn, and by the time he carried water down, she had already read the soil and begun to terrace the run where the spring would reach. She planted things he didn't recognize, seeds she had carried in paper packets, sewn into the lining of her coat, and she worked the rows with a speed that surprised him because he had taken her for delicate back on the platform. She turned dead ground into something living without ever asking how it was done here, as if the ground already knew and only needed someone willing to listen to it. Within 2 weeks, the first green was up in rows straight as fence lines. He took a bad cut from a fence wire a week in, a deep gouge across the back of his left hand that he bound up with a rag, and ignored the way he ignored everything that might slow the work. By the third day, the skin around it had gone hot and tight and red, and the red had started to climb his wrist toward his elbow. He hid it in his shirt until the fever made him clumsy enough that she saw it across the yard. She didn't ask permission and didn't wait for him to sit down. She opened a small wooden case he had never noticed among her things, and inside it lay needles so fine they caught no light. Tools she said her grandmother had used in Kyoto before she was born, set in a row like something between thread and wire. She worked over his hand with the steady care of someone who had done this 100 times on worse. By morning, the heat had gone out of the wound, and the red had stopped climbing, and the pain had dropped to a dull ache he could think past. He watched his own flesh heal faster than it had any right to. He didn't know what to call what she had done, so he called it nothing and went back to the fence and drove posts until his arms burned. That night, he sat on the porch and looked at the closed hand and then at the window where her lamp still burned, and for the first time, the loneliness in him loosened a notch. Not because she had cured him, but because she had noticed he was hurt and hadn't waited to be asked. It was a small thing, and he didn't make more of it than it was. But a man alone, 3 years, learns to read the weight of a kindness by how little the giver makes of it, and she made nothing of it at all. The word got out the way words do in a place with nothing else to talk about. The ranch hands began to watch her with the kind of attention that wasn't curiosity but suspicion. The careful eye men turn on anything they can't sort into a box they already know. Walt, the foreman, called her, strange behind her back, and meant it as a warning. The way a man warns you off a horse he thinks will throw you sooner or later. Remington shut it down once, flat, and the word wife came out harder than he planned. The silence after it told him the men heard something in his voice he hadn't meant to show. It was a few mornings later that he caught her through the window. First light, the yard still blue with cold, and she was moving in slow, exact arcs out by the fence line, a long shape in her hands, turning through forms he had no name for. It looked like a dance, and it looked like a drill, and it was neither. Something controlled and deliberate that had nothing of ceremony in it, each movement ending where the next one began, like the whole thing had been written down somewhere and she was reading it back. He watched until she finished, and she finished as exactly as she had begun, and she went inside without knowing he had seen, or perhaps knowing and not caring. He didn't interrupt and didn't ask. The question had shifted inside him from what is she doing to what was she trained for. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer yet, so he let it sit and went back to his own work with the shape of her moving in his head all day. A month in, the supplies ran low, and there was no way around a trip into Coyote Wash, so he loaded the buckboard and took her with him because leaving her alone at the ranch felt worse than taking her into town. The general store sat at one end of the single street and the saloon at the other, and between them the kind of men who couldn't tell one Asian face from another and didn't try, who called everyone from across the Pacific by the same wrong name and shrugged when they got it wrong. She walked beside him with the same composure she had carried off the train, and the stairs landed on her and slid off the way rain slides off oiled leather. He was proud of her for that, and then surprised at himself for being proud. The trouble started at the wagon. He was inside the store settling the bill when a drunk came off the saloon porch and reached into the buckboard for the trunk. Maybe to steal it, maybe just to bother her. The kind of man whose reason is never the point of the thing. She didn't scream and didn't step back into the store for help. She put herself between the man and the trunk and stood there the way she stood at dawn, her weight settled and her hands low, and the drunk pulled up short because something in her stillness told him this wasn't the easy mark he had picked. He reached again, and she didn't move, and the reach died in the air between them, and the people on the plank walk slowed to watch, because a woman who won't flinch is a rarer sight in Coyote Wash than a gunfight. Remington came out and saw it, and the anger hit him before the thought did. He stepped between her and the man and said the line that changed the air in the street, low and without heat. "That's my wife." One claim 4 words, and the saloon noise dropped a notch, and the drunk's hands came up empty, and he drifted back the way drunks do when the fun leaves a thing. She didn't thank him, and he hadn't done it for thanks, and they loaded the wagon and drove home with the trunk still locked, and something between them that neither of them named, a thread pulled tight that hadn't been there that morning. It was in the saloon later, when he went back alone for tobacco and a word with the barkeep, that the other name surfaced. The Hatcher Gang, riders who had been hitting isolated ranches to the south, burning out the holders who wouldn't pay tribute, and leaving the rest to lie awake and wonder when their turn would come down the road. The sheriff in Coyote Wash was a political man who wouldn't ride out for a ranch as far from town as the Broken Spur, and everyone in the room knew it and said nothing useful about it. The barkeep poured him another drink and changed the subject as if the gang were weather and not men. Remington heard the threat and filed it as someone else's problem, the way a man files a sound in the night when he doesn't want to be awake, and he rode home with the tobacco and the name turning over in his head. On the ride home, she asked him one thing about the gang. The first question she had ever asked him about his world, and he answered it and didn't understand why she asked. She went quiet after that, and he caught her glancing at the open country around the ranch, the way she had glanced at the soil, reading it for what it would grow and what it would let walk in. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was the careful attention of a person measuring ground she might have to stand on. The outer pasture went first. He rode out at dawn to check the north fence and found the cattle scattered across the draw and 2 steers left cut open in the grass, steaming in the cold, with a fence post carved in a mark he recognized from the saloon talk. It was the Hatcher mark, and beside it a line scratched into the wood that said "Pay or Burn," and the handwriting was the kind that meant it, and left no room for a man to talk himself out of what it meant. He stood over the dead steers and felt the arithmetic start in his head. The slow count of what he had against what was coming. The numbers didn't add up to anything he liked. Walt quit before the sun was over the ridge. The foreman saddled up and rode out without a word, beyond a look that said he had a family in town and a ranch wasn't worth dying over. And Remington couldn't argue with the math of it because the man was right and they both knew it. 2 of the 3 hands followed him by nightfall, because courage is a thing that travels in a herd and leaves in one. By dark, the broken spur was down to 3 people, Remington and Mary, and a hand named Sam Whitlow, who was 18 and too young to know better and too loyal to leave. The quiet of the place had turned into the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, the quiet of a ranch that has been measured and found worth taking. He expected her to want to go. He expected the trunk to come open and the bag to be packed, and the careful question of how a woman gets back to a train from a ranch this far out in the territory. She didn't pack, didn't mention the trunk, didn't ask about the train. She asked him where the house's weakest wall faced, and he told her the south side where the yard ran open to the draw, and she walked out and looked at it and came back and said nothing more about it. He started to understand that her calm wasn't coldness, but the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, the stillness of a person who has run the numbers too and decided to stay anyway. They worked through the night, reinforcing the yard, and she worked beside him without being asked, hauling water and holding timber, and not once slowing while he drove the braces into the fence posts. Sam ran between them with the frantic energy of a boy who wanted to prove he wasn't afraid, dropping nails and picking them up with shaking hands, and she steadied him without speaking by simply keeping her pace next to his until his breathing matched hers. By midnight, Remington stopped and looked at the 3 of them against the dark and the open range, the braced fence and the one lamp in the window, and the sky going on forever over all of it. For the first time, the ranch felt small to him, smaller than the sky over it, smaller than the sound of horses he couldn't yet hear, but knew were out there, somewhere coming down the road toward the only thing he had left. He looked at Mary standing in the yard with her sleeves rolled and her hands dirty and her face the same as it had been on the platform, and he understood she wasn't staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because someone had walked up to her door and scratched a threat into her fence, and that was the one thing she had been raised not to walk away from. The difference between her reason and his was the difference between a code and a hope. The storm rolled in after midnight, the kind that turns the yard to mud and makes the kerosene lamps gutter and spit in their brackets, and the wind came in long pushes that bent the shutters and let the rain find the gaps. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle by the amber light, the parts laid out on a cloth in the order they went back together, and she sat across from him with the trunk behind her chair, and the storm loud against the walls. He hadn't asked her about the dawn forms again, and she hadn't offered, and the not asking had become its own kind of wall between them. Now the storm and the morning after it were about to take that wall down. She told him a piece of the truth, the way you give a piece when the whole of it's too heavy to hand over at once. Her father had been a man who taught soldiers to fight, and she had learned at his side before she learned to want anything else for herself. She had come west because there was nothing left for her to defend at home, and a person with nothing to defend is a person who has lost the point of herself. She said it without self-pity and without pride, the way a person states a fact about the weather, and the lamp between them threw her shadow long and steady against the wall behind her. Then she opened the trunk. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a blade he had never seen the like of, a curved, single-edged steel head mounted on a long wooden shaft, longer than he was tall and balanced like it knew its own weight and where to put it. She told him it was a naginata, the weapon of the women of her family's line, the Onabogashia who defended the house and the threshold when the men were away. He didn't know the word, but he knew the look of a blade that had been used and cleaned and used again. She drew the cloth back, and the steel caught the lamplight and held it along the curve. The shape of it was nothing like a dance and nothing like ceremony. The way a hand, with a callus across the palm is nothing like a hand that has only held a pen. She told him the forms he had glimpsed at dawn were kata, the patterns her father had drilled into her until they lived in her arms and not in her memory, and that the weapon's reach was built for exactly this, for holding a threshold against more than one attacker when the door is the only thing between the people inside and the people who came to take what they had. Her father died in a quarrel that wasn't hers to win, and the house and the name had gone to a brother who had no use for a sister who fought. The agency and the ocean and the letter were the way out of a place that no longer had a door for her to stand in. She said it the way she said everything, plain and without complaint, as though the loss were a season she had already walked through and could now describe from the other side. He had thought it was ceremony. Now he understood it was rehearsal, and that distinction sat in his chest like the weight of the trunk itself. She didn't ask his permission to use it. She set the naginata by the door and went to sleep in her clothes, with her back to the wall. He didn't sleep. For the first time, he was afraid of the morning, and the fear had nothing to do with the gang and everything to do with how little he had understood the woman he had ordered to be meek. Dawn came gray and wet. The storm gone east and left a heavy sky behind it, and the riders came down off the ridge before the light was full. 6 of them rode loose and easy, the way men ride when they expect no real answer, with Deacon Hatcher at the front, on a big horse, a big man who had burned out 2 ranches to the south and expected this one to fold the same way the others had. They came for tribute, or they came for the ranch. Either way, they didn't expect a fight because no one out here had ever given them one, and they had stopped planning for the day. Someone might. Remington met them from the yard with the rifle up and Sam behind the well frame with the shotgun, and he called out for them to stop where they were and turn around and ride back the way they came. Hatcher dismounted to make it personal, the way a man does when he wants the fear more than he wants the money, and he walked forward slow, with his hands wide and a grin on his face that said he had heard this kind of talk before, and it had never cost him anything. The first shots broke the morning open. Remington was a good shot, and he put one into the dirt near Hatcher's boot to make the point. But they were 6, and he was 1 rifle and a boy, and the fight tilted against him inside of a minute. A bullet took him across the arm, and he went down behind the well frame, with the rifle ringing against the stones, the blood running hot down into his sleeve, and the world going gray at the edges of his sight. Sam fired the shotgun twice and missed once, and the gang used the gap to swing wide toward the house, 2 of them moving low along the fence while the rest kept his head down with fire from the ridge of the barn. Remington shouted at the boy to stay down and hold his rounds, but the fear was in Sam now, and the boy was firing at shapes and burning through shells he couldn't afford to spend. He watched the 2 men reach the corner of the house and knew they were going to walk through his door, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it from the dirt. He tried to rise, and the arm wouldn't hold him, and he went back against the stones with his teeth clenched against the sound that wanted out of him. The helplessness of it was worse than the bullet, because the bullet was in his arm, and the helplessness was in his chest. The door opened, and Mari stepped into the frame. She held the naginata low and quiet, and the blade caught the weak light along its curve. She didn't speak and didn't shout a warning, because the weapon was the warning, and she had already decided how this ended before her foot touched the boards. The first man through the door came at her, expecting a frightened woman, and found the reach of the shaft instead, the long arc that cut the distance down before a revolver could clear leather, and his gun hand went wide, and his footing went with it. She broke his reach with a turn that sent his arm wide and sent him stumbling into the door frame. The second came in low and met the shaft across his knuckles and backed off, shaking blood out of his grip and the courage out of his face. Hatcher himself came last, and came sure, the big man with the big reach, and he learned what the weapon was made for when the blade found the space his size couldn't cover, the long steel reaching past his guard the way a hand reaches past a closing door. It was discipline, not rage. The kata did what the kata was built to do, holding the threshold the way her father had taught her to hold one, each movement ending where the next one began. The men who could still run broke for their horses, and the yard emptied into the gray morning as fast as it had filled, and the quiet that came after was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Remington lay against the well frame with his arm pinned to his chest, and watched her clean the blade on a cloth the way she cleaned it every dawn, calm and exact. The understanding landed in him like the bullet had, deep and final. The woman he had ordered to be meek had just held his ranch with a blade he had thought was a dance, and the protective line he had thrown in the saloon had turned inside out in the gray light. She hadn't needed him to stand between her and danger. She stood between him and ruin instead, and she did it without raising her voice and without asking whether he deserved it. Sam bound his arm with the steady hands of a boy who had just aged 10 years in a morning, pulling the cloth tight the way Remington had taught him to pull a cinch. The bleeding stopped and the pain settled into the dull, heavy throb of a thing that would heal if he let it. Mary carried the naginata back inside and wrapped it again in the oiled cloth, the ritual of it as careful as the dawn forms, and she set it back in the trunk and closed the lid and fitted the lock with the same small, hard click that had put a border around her on the first night. She didn't celebrate because to her this wasn't a victory but a duty discharged, the thing she had been raised to do and had finally been allowed to do, and the calm on her face was the same calm she had worn on the platform. He tried to thank her, and she wouldn't take it, and the refusal wasn't coldness, but the simple logic of a woman who doesn't thank a person for breathing. He stopped trying to name what she was. The foreign woman, the strange bride, the quiet wife he had ordered out of loneliness in a photograph, and he started instead to see what she was, a person who had stood her ground because that was what her code required of her, and not because anyone asked. It was not love, not even trust, but a recognition, the kind that passes between two people who have both learned what it costs to stand alone and just saw that the other one knows the price and paid it without flinching. He asked her finally what she wanted now that the ranch was still standing and the riders were gone and the morning belonged to them. She said, garden, the lock, and the dawn, the same 3 terms from the first night, and he understood for the first time that they had never been demands at all. They were the conditions under which a samurai's daughter could agree to stay, the line she drew so that what she was would survive the crossing. He had spent a month resenting a boundary that was really just a woman keeping her honor intact in a place that had no word for it and no interest in learning one. Mari kept her garden, and the lock stayed on the trunk, and at first, light every morning, she walked out to the fence line, where the steel turned slow through the forms her father gave her, the naginata leaning against the doorframe behind her when she came back in. The broken spur still stood because a woman who set her terms wouldn't move off them, and a rancher who had ordered calm learned that fire, well kept, is the thing that keeps the dark out. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.